Very much and welcome.
President William Ruto, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to everybody.
Good afternoon.
I thank President Ruto for his warm hospitality and his warm words. This is my first official visit to Kenya, and I'm delighted to be here today. Despite being geographically quite distant, Singapore and Kenya have similar outlooks. Our peoples share similar aspirations, such as inclusive growth, a high standard of living, ethnic and religious harmony, and good housing, healthcare, education. We share similar views on the challenges faced by the Global South. We both worry about growing geopolitical tensions, rising protectionism, threats to the multilateral trading system, inflation, pandemics, and climate change. We agreed that it was important that countries continue to work towards building linkages in the digital economy, cooperating on food, energy security, and sustainable development. The President and I reaffirmed the warm and long-standing relations between Singapore and Kenya. 2 years ago, we celebrated our 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations, and our two countries cooperate and exchange experiences in areas such as governance, public service administration, urban planning, and livable cities. Our economic cooperation has been growing. Kenya is one of Singapore's important trading partners in sub-Saharan Africa. Despite COVID, bilateral trade in 2021 increased by almost a quarter year on year. Several Singapore companies are operating in Kenya in a variety of sectors: shipping, logistics and port management systems, agribusiness, hospitality and fintech solutions, amongst others. A delegation of Singapore companies is in Nairobi. They came with me to pursue opportunities for investments and partnerships with Kenyan companies. Our two countries also collaborate well in multilateral fora. President Ruto and I reaffirmed our shared commitment to multilateralism and a rules-based global order. Singapore and Kenya agreed to continue our cooperation at the UN and other multilateral co-organizations and to cooperate on UN reform to enhance its effectiveness. We discussed new areas of cooperation, first on information and communication technologies. We just signed an MOU in this area, which will allow both sides to exchange best practices and knowledge in ICT and promote talent development and innovations. The MOU will also facilitate and strengthen strategic cooperation in cybersecurity. Secondly, on climate change, we signed an MOU in carbon credits collaboration under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and this will encourage, develop, and facilitate collaborative carbon credit projects of mutual interest. International collaboration, such as this agreement between Singapore and Kenya, is critical to promoting global climate action to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Third, on human capital development. Both our countries placed heavy emphasis on nurturing talent. The MOU on skills development will encourage closer technical cooperation between both countries in areas such as leadership and governance, education, and digitalization. And this will take place through knowledge exchange, capacity building courses, and other cooperation. There is great potential to expand our bilateral cooperation. Kenya's strategic location serves as a gateway for Singapore companies into East Africa. Likewise, Singapore can serve as a gateway for Kenyan companies into Southeast Asia. I welcome the ratification of the Bilateral Investment Treaty and the President's commitment to settle the avoidance of the double taxation agreement between our two countries as soon as possible. These moves send a strong positive signal to businesses and provide clarity and assurance on the cross-border transactions and investment. I look forward to working with President Ruto and his government to bring our bilateral relations to even greater heights I'm very happy that the President has accepted my invitation to visit Singapore, and I look forward to receiving him before too long, and if all goes well, early next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. We have a few questions from the journalists. Kindly identify yourself and who you are addressing the question to. Thank you. And the media house you represent.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister, President Ruto. I'm Geraldine from CNA. I would like to ask what you think Kenya's value is to Singapore in terms of not just business and trade, but also expanding Singapore's diplomacy in Africa.
Well, economics is, of course, a very important part of any two countries' relations, and between Singapore and Kenya, as I explained, we have good economic ties and they are growing. But Kenya is also a very important country in Africa. In East Africa particularly, it has a key role, not just as the hub and as a base from which we can extend our reach to the rest of East Africa, but also a role in the region's security and stability. And Singapore has goodwill in Africa and in Kenya. We have many friends here. It goes back a long way. In fact, in 1964, when we were in Malaysia, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew visited Africa on a tour, and Kenya was one of the countries which he came to, and he called on President Jomo Kenyatta. And we've maintained those ties since, and it is important to Singapore that we cultivate friends and partners all over the world, because in the global scheme of things, we are all quite small countries, and small countries need to make common cause with one another on issues which concern us all, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change, whether it's nuclear non-proliferation, or the sanctity of the UN Charter and the inviolability of international borders, which was what was at stake when Russia invaded Ukraine. And therefore, it's important for me to visit Kenya and to be in Africa and to show that this is important to us and that we would like to develop our relations with our friends further.
Okay. Next question.
Prime Minister Lee and President William Ruto, I'm Sydney Chazima from NTV. My question goes to the seemingly trade imbalance between Kenya and Singapore, in that Kenya exports around $10 million to Singapore, and Kenya imports around 130-something million US dollars. Is there any sort of agreement between the two countries to bridge that gap? Thank you.
We have not focused on this. We want to expand our economic relationship. We would like to develop the trade. And we want both Kenya's exports to Singapore and Singapore's exports to Kenya to grow. I think whether it's $10 million or $190 million is both still relatively small and very small compared to what it could be and what we should make them. And I think our focus should be to grow the trade and to do it in a way which Kenyan companies can benefit and Kenyan consumers can benefit. And likewise in Singapore, Singapore companies see new business opportunities and Singapore consumers see new sources of fruit, vegetables, tourism, flowers, so many things which Kenya provides.
I agree with Prime Minister Lee. Part of the agreements that we have signed today, whether it's the bilateral investment treaty and what we are working on the avoidance of double taxation, are part of the instruments that we will leverage on to encourage the private sector investment and trade between our two countries, so that what Prime Minister Lee rightfully describes as very low trade volumes, we can be able to scale our trade, scale our investment, and begin the journey to leverage the imbalance between our trade. And secondly, it is a clear signal to us in Kenya that we need to do more about our exports. As we are all aware, our exports as a percentage of GDP came down from 28% to 10%. It is the reason why we are expanding our county industrial and aggregation centers. It is the reason why we will have new 5 export promotion zones in the Republic of Kenya, because exports as a percentage of GDP is even reflected in the trade between us and Singapore. There is scale, there is scope for us to export more, not just into Singapore, but to the rest of the world. But value addition and agro-processing will play a big part of our ability to be able to export. And that is why the bottom-up economic transformation agenda is focused on ensuring that we build the necessary capacity for us to do value addition and for us to engage in agro-processing, so that our flowers, our coffee, our tea, our avocados can find their way into Singapore. And I want to thank Prime Minister Lee for agreeing that Singapore can be the gateway into the Southeast Asia and the whole of that region. So we are building the necessary blocks on our side, and we are building the necessary ecosystem together with Singapore to facilitate increase in trade.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister Lee and President Ruto. This is Ke Yang from Lianhe Zaobao, Singapore. I have a question on the new areas of collaboration between the two countries, and in particular on climate action. With an MOU inked earlier on carbon credit. Would you like to comment how will the two countries actually move forward and on issues that face the mankind, both on bilateral and multilateral forums? And what is your vision of what can be achieved by the two countries? Thank you.
The MOU expresses our intention to collaborate and for Singapore to take advantage of carbon credits which Kenya will be able to provide. Carbon credits which are compliant with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and which therefore can be used to fulfill our nationally determined contributions, NDCs. In other words, what we have committed to reduce our carbon footprint, some part of that we can fulfill through compliant carbon credits, and Kenya is producing such carbon credits. We need such carbon credits, and therefore we would like to work together on that. And the MOU expresses our intention to conclude an agreement to work together on that. Climate change is a very serious problem for the whole world. In Singapore, we see warmer weather. You may think it's just a blip, but actually it's a long-term trend, and it's going to accentuate. In Africa, in Kenya, we also see extremes of weather, extremes of drought and of floods. And it's existential because human beings, cattle, wildlife, all are threatened when the climate gets extreme. And therefore, countries have to work together in order to reduce global emissions of carbon, in order to reduce global warming, and slow down the process of change, of climate change, so that countries and mankind have got time to adapt. And we want to work closely with Kenya and many other countries in order to do that.
I think precisely what Prime Minister Lee has said, that if there is one phenomena that is urgent,